What's going on, guys? Gamers Goon here today with your men's bracket, the March Madness bracket. This is my first take of it all. Obviously, as I try to find the perfect bracket and do my own perfect brackets, we will make plenty of more brackets. But this is the YouTube bracket first take. It came out just a few moments ago. Just got done watching Selection Sunday, but here we go. And we started off in the South, Alabama, going up against the winner of the play-in game between Texas A&M. I think that means community college. Not really sure. Or I'm not really sure what that means. It might mean community. I'm not sure what AMCC means, but I know that's a Texas A&M something or another school. And I think this is South something Missouri. But either way, you don't really see these 1-16 upsets very often. It only happened one time to Virginia, so we're going to take Alabama here. And then we're going to go on to a game that I don't feel like should be an 8-9 game, Maryland versus West Virginia. This number here, to me, is really alarming if you're West Virginia. They give up around 70-something points a game, and Maryland's able to score 70-something points a game. The defense pretty good for Maryland, whereas the offense is pretty good for Western Virginia. But I really don't feel like West Virginia is all that great. So I'm taking Maryland. I think they definitely are able to score against a slightly worse defense. I think their offense or their defense of Maryland is going to stagger Western Virginia a little bit more than expected. Then we get to this San Diego State versus Charleston game. San Diego State, a team that I don't think is necessarily deserving of a 5 seed, but they're here. Yes, they have a good record, but they also have struggled at points this year. They lost to Boise State earlier this year. I don't know if they're going to mention it. Big loss to Arizona, lost to St. Mary's. Utah State doesn't strike me as a great win. Arkansas, they are in the tournament. They split with Boise State. They split with Nevada. They split with New Mexico State. Charleston, on the other hand, they lost big to North Carolina. They beat Kent State, another tournament team. They beat Virginia Tech, who is not a tournament team. But I think if you're going into this at San Diego State, you might go in a little bit underestimating Charleston. And this is where I might shock a few people, but I think Charleston picks this victory up. I think they're one of the upsets that happens in that first round. Then we get Virginia versus Furman. Once again, this just feels disrespectful. Really good defense from Virginia. A pretty solid offense. Furman, on the other hand, a pretty good defense. A really solid offense. They really haven't played anybody, though. Their best game is against NC State, another tournament team. Penn State, they lost. Houston for Virginia, Baylor. Baylor's just more battle-tested than Furman. And you gotta, if you're a Furman fan, that's not a good draw for you. Virginia wins that game, probably. And this is a game I'm really excited for. I think this is going to be a great matchup. Very similar defenses, pretty similar offenses. The BPI ranking is slightly off. But you look at these teams, they are teams that could win against top-tier competition. You have a close loss to Kansas. You have a Miami loss. Miami's really good. They played against Virginia. They did get tested against Virginia. They didn't have a good showing here. They split with North Carolina, but they split with Duke. And Creighton, another team. They split with a good UConn team. They lost to a Texas team. They lost to an Arizona team. They lost twice to a good Marquette team. They lost twice to a Xavier team that's really good. They were able to beat an Arkansas. They were able to beat another tournament team in Providence. They played close against Arizona State that's playing their way into the tournament. So both of these teams have opponents that are in this tournament. Both of these teams have been battle tested. I'm going to take Creighton, but I think that's going to be a really fun game. Then we get to Baylor versus UCSB. Good defense here for UC Santa Barbara. Baylor, pretty solid defense as well. But points per game, Baylor's a little bit better. And you just got to think the star power from UC Santa Barbara is probably going to be a little bit too much to handle. Baylor does have big wins against UCLA, Gonzaga, Kansas, Texas. Marquette's a huge bad loss. Kansas State's a bad loss. Iowa State's a very bad stretch of games. TCU split it with them. This Baylor team is not by any means, I think, worthy of the 3 spot, but they obviously can play basketball, and they are a solid team, but I don't think that they're going to get upset there by UC Santa Barbara. I think Creighton and Baylor will be battling it out in the round of 32. Then we get to Missouri versus Utah State. I feel like this is kind of disrespectful. Missouri, a team that I think should have been ranked higher for much of the year. Very good team, 6 top 25 wins. They beat Tennessee 2 times. They played Alabama, lost. They lost bad to Kansas. They lost bad to Texas A&M. They were able to beat Iowa State, another tournament team. They're able to beat Kentucky, another tournament team. They beat Illinois, another tournament team. They split with another tournament team in Arkansas. Utah State played that San Diego State team that we think might not be as good as their record shows. They lost 3 times there. They lost a game out of 3 to I also feel like a pretty weak Boise State team. They split with a Nevada team that's going to have to play their way in. They were able to beat a Oral Roberts team that did make it into the tournament, and they were able to beat New Mexico. But I think the battle-tested Missouri Tigers are probably the more likely outcome here, so we're taking Missouri. And then Arizona versus Princeton. I don't really even know if I want to click onto this. Better defense for Princeton, way better offense, about 6 points per game better. Just look at the battle-testedness of these two teams. You look at this. They beat UCLA twice. They beat Tennessee. They beat that San Diego State team. They beat that Creighton team. They did have a bad loss to Oregon, and they did beat a Utah team. But you look at Prince. Their big win was against Yale. I don't think that's going to be enough for Princeton. And I'm going to have to take Arizona, unfortunately, for the Princeton team. I can't pick them. Then we get into the Midwest. We got Houston versus Northern Kentucky. And this is kind of disrespectful. Houston, a really good defensive team. We knew that coming in. North Kentucky, once again, another good defensive team. A really good offense, about a 19-point per game spread. And the slightly worse offense there for Northern Kentucky. But Houston, not a team that has had many big matchups. They have beat a St. Mary's team. They have beat a Virginia team. They beat an Oregon team. They played an Alabama team. They won twice and then lost today to a Memphis team. Whereas you look at Northern Kentucky, they were able to beat a big Cincinnati team, but another tournament team, Kent State, they lost to. They lost to Toledo. They lost to Washington State. They lost by FAU. They lost to a lot of non-tournament teams. Their biggest win of the season was Cincinnati, and they're not a tournament team. And for that reason, I got to go Houston. This is another game I think is going to be a close one. You look at this, a solid defense from Auburn that's going to stagger that 80 points per game offense from Iowa. That's about in line, their offense and defense combined between Auburn and Iowa. Both of these teams, I feel like they're going to be in a dogfight. This is one of those matchups that you could look at. But you look at Iowa, lost twice to Illinois. They won 1 time against Purdue. They were able to beat Ohio State. They lost to a Wisconsin team. They split with a Michigan team. They beat Indiana twice, another tournament team. Another Iowa State team they lost to. It's a tournament team. They beat Michigan State. They just had an up-and-down season, Iowa has. Whereas Auburn, they've lost twice to an Alabama team. They've split with a Tennessee. They've lost to West Virginia close. They split with an Arkansas. They lost badly to a Kentucky. They lost to an A&M. They lost to a Memphis. They barely beat Northwestern. Both of these teams have had up-and-down years. And I think you just got to rely on the offense. And if you're relying on offense to win a game, I think Iowa's that team that wins that game. Then you get to Miami-Drake. Unfortunately for Drake, I don't necessarily think that this is a fair matchup for them. They did beat a Mississippi State. They did win twice against a Bradley team. But you're looking at a Miami team that has a little bit more battle-tested. They beat a tough Virginia team. They played that Duke team and won. They were able to split with the North Carolina State, a tournament team. They were able to play Clemson. They were able to play against Providence, another tournament team. A Rutgers team that was in a tough conference that was playing well this season. That Maryland loss looks bad, but Drake, I don't think you have the battle-tested ability to beat this Miami team. I think Miami's going to pull out in that one. And then we get to Indiana versus Kent State. Pretty solid, similar defenses and similar offenses on both of these teams. But this right here is why I think Kent State has a chance. They barely lost to a Houston team. They barely lost to a Gonzaga team. They barely lost to a Charleston team that I think is going to go far. Indiana, they're a tough team. They've beat one of the top teams in Purdue. They beat Xavier. They beat Michigan State. They beat Illinois. They beat Northwest. They played Northwestern and lost. But they've had some of these games and they have been battle tested. But I don't think you can sit there and say that Kent State also hasn't been battle tested. And for the sake of this video and the sake of upsets, I think Kent State wins this game. Indiana, they've at times struggled, and I think this could be one of those times. And I think Kent State wins that game. Then we get Iowa State going up against the winner of Mississippi State and Pittsburgh. We don't know who they're playing against. I think Mississippi State probably wins that game. But Iowa State, a team that's had an up-and-down year also, lost big to a UConn. They were able to beat a Kansas, but lost twice to them. They split with a Texas team. They were able to beat a top-tier Baylor team. They split with a Kansas State, a tournament team. They beat a TCU team twice that's been in the tournament. They lost to a West Virginia twice. They played Iowa and lost big. They've had an up-and-down year with some big wins, some bad losses. But I think this is where Iowa State figures it out and gets another victory to add to their resume. Then we get to Xavier versus Kennesaw State. Pretty good defense there for Kennesaw. Xavier a little bit worse. But Xavier can put up points at will, and Kennesaw State similar, but a little bit less. Kennesaw State, they've had some bad losses. Tournament-tested teams in Indiana, San Diego State, and VCU, they lost. They lost by 3 to VCU, and that was their best loss because the next ones were double digits. Xavier, on the other hand, they beat a tough UConn team. They beat a Marquette team that's in the tournament. They've beat a Creighton team that's in the tournament. They've been tested by that Indiana team. They've been tested by that West Virginia team. They've been tested by that Providence team. They've been tested by Gonzaga. Xavier wins this game. That's basically what we're getting at. I got to go Xavier to win that game. Then we get A&M versus Penn State. This Penn State team almost pulled up the upset against Purdue. They lost 3 times against Purdue, but they almost pulled it off. They beat Illinois 2 times. Maryland, they split with. Rutgers, they lost twice. Indiana, they beat twice. Northwestern, they won twice. This A&M team's been over the map too. They split with an Alabama. They beat a Tennessee team that's tough. They beat Arkansas twice. That's tough. They beat Auburn. That's we think should be a decent little team. They were able to beat Missouri twice. They lost to Kentucky. Both of these teams have had up and down seasons, but I think Penn State's currently playing their best basketball, and you got to bank on the best basketball being played currently, and Penn State's doing that. So I'm taking Penn State there. Then we get Texas versus Colgate. I don't think this is all that big of a differential between the two teams. You look at this, similar defenses, pretty similar offenses, huge difference in the BPI. Colgate really hasn't played anybody. Auburn, they lost big. They barely lost to a Vermont team that made it to the tournament. They beat a Syracuse team that didn't make it to the tournament. But I think this game's going to remain close, but obviously Texas a little bit more battle-tested. We're going with Texas in that game. Then we go down to the East. We got Purdue versus Texas Southern or whoever FDU is. Oh, I think this is like Fair High Dickinson or something. It doesn't really matter because neither of those teams are stopping Zach Edey in March. It doesn't really matter. We don't really need to talk too much about it. Zach Edey going to dominate them. Whichever one of those poor teams got to go up against them. Memphis versus FAU. Memphis just got done beating Houston today. FAU, another tough team. They were able to beat North Texas a couple times. They were able to beat UAB. They were able to beat Florida. But none of those things match up to a Houston victory today. None of those match up to a close watch against Bama or an A&M victory or an Auburn victory. So we're going with that Memphis team with their battle-testedness. Then Duke versus Oral Roberts. Duke is a team that we don't really respect this season. You look at it, they have potential to get to that because the defense of Oral Roberts isn't as good as the defense they had, but Oral Roberts also known to put up points. Bad loss to a Houston team. A loss to a St. Mary's team, a loss to a Utah State team, a loss to a New Mexico team, a Liberty victory. And then you look at the other ones. You look at Duke, they've had some good wins. They've had Xavier, they've had Miami, they've had Virginia. But I think this is just the hope in me that's going to do this. There's really no rhyme or reason why I'm doing this, but I think Max Abmas and company and Oral Roberts are going to win that game. I got Oral Roberts beating Duke first round. Duke's going to get upset. Then we get Tennessee versus Louisiana. Good defense from Tennessee. Not necessarily the same thing to be said about the Raging Cajuns, but better scorers. But they've had 2 bad losses to tournament teams in Drake and Texas. And then you look at a Tennessee team. They've been tested by Bama. They've been tested by Kansas. They've been tested by Texas. They've been tested by Arizona. They've been tested by Kentucky. Tennessee's had tough games all season long. And while I think they are susceptible to getting beat, I don't know if it's against Louisiana. I got them winning that game. Then we get Kentucky versus Providence. And this is where we're going to see a little bit of maybe an upset. Providence, I think, shouldn't be as low as 11th. As you see, their BPI, only 39th. Not too bad. A little bit worse defense, a little bit better offense from them. They beat a UConn team. They beat a Marquette team. They beat a Creighton team. They've played an Xavier team twice. They played a TCU team. They played a Miami team. They've been in tough games all season long. Same thing with Kentucky, with UCLA, Gonzaga, Tennessee, Bama, A&M, all those teams. It can't be said enough that both of these teams have been battle-tested. And at the end of the day, I think Providence is going to be the team to pull off the upset there. We get Kansas State versus Montana State. A little bit better defense there for Montana State, but a lot of top 25 games for Kansas State. Better offense. 2 bad losses for Montana State. Oregon team that didn't make it, lost by 30. Tournament team, they lost by 21 too. I don't think Kansas State is probably going to lose here. Montana State, they drew a bad card. A little bit battle-tested there for Kansas State. You're not winning that game. This is another game that could be interesting. Michigan State versus USC. I think both teams are very similar. Both teams are slightly out of their element, I think. Both teams have been tested at points this season, but both teams have had up and down years. That's not a good loss for Tennessee against Oregon. But you look at some of these games for even Michigan State, they barely beat an Oregon team that was running like 6 players. So both of these teams just haven't really had great years. I'm going to take USC. We got to think of some 10 seeds that could win. I think USC is probably one of those 10 seeds. They can go either way, though. Marquette versus Vermont, I don't really even know if I want to talk about it. Better offense by Marquette. Better defense from Vermont, but Purdue, close loss, twice against UConn, big win to Baylor, big 2-time win against Creighton, 2-time win against Xavier, beat a Providence team, beat a Mississippi State, or lost to a Mississippi State team close. Vermont's got smacked by a St. Mary's team, lost to a USC team, barely beat a Colgate team that might not even go far. They lost by 21 to an Iona team. They lost to a Yale team that didn't make it. Marquette's going to win that game pretty handedly. I'm sorry. Kansas versus Howard. I feel like this, once again, is disrespectful. Very similar offenses, a little bit better defense there. But the BPI, 9th to 224. And you look at who just Howard's played. They got smacked by Yale. They got smacked by Kentucky. They lost to VCU. Howard's not winning this game. They're not. I'm sorry. They're just not. You look at Arkansas and Illinois. 2 teams, similar defenses, similar offenses. BPI, Arkansas is better. Illinois is not. Both teams been battle-tested. Illinois had a little bit more success out of those tests. They were able to beat a good UCLA team. They played close against a good Purdue team. They were able to beat a top Texas team. They lost to an Indiana team twice. They got beat by Virginia. They beat a Michigan State team that's in the tournament. They split with a Northwestern team. They lost 3 times to a Penn State team. But you look at Arkansas, very similar. Lost twice to a Bama. They lost to Creighton. They lost to Tennessee. They lost to Baylor. They barely beat San Diego State. They split with Kentucky. They lost twice to A&M. They split with Missouri. Both of these teams have had up and down years, and when both teams are at their best, they could beat and handle almost any team in the country. The problem is, we don't know whether or not they're going to wake up and feel like they want to play the best basketball on that particular day. And that's a scary thing to say for this, because this is not when you wanna have those questions. But either team could win this. The pride in me is making me take Illinois, but I wouldn't be shocked if Arkansas wins that. Then you get St. Mary's versus VCU. Two similar defenses, a little bit better for St. Mary's. Basically similar offenses. BPI rank significantly favors them. Bad loss to Memphis, a close loss to an Arizona State team, a Pittsburgh win, and then won 2 games against Dayton. Houston lost close, St. Mary's. Gonzaga they were able to beat. San Diego State they were able to beat. Oral Roberts they were able to beat. But I think this is just me delaying the inevitable that St. Mary's is probably going to win that game. Then we get to Iona and UConn. They were able to beat a Vermont team that's in it, but once again, this UConn team beat a Bama team. They had that battle from a Marquette team. They beat a Creighton team. They've played an Iowa State team. They played that Xavier team twice. They played Providence. They've been battle-tested, and I think UConn probably wins that one. Then we get TCU versus Arizona State. Arizona State's beating Nevada. We don't need to talk about it. Arizona State having a good run currently. They got beat by Arizona, unfortunately, but they were having a good run there in the Pac-12 for a minute against this TCU team. This TCU team has had an up-and-down season too, but I think that's a lot of these teams that are in this 6 to 10 range, teams that have had up-and-down seasons, and ASU's played somewhat pretty good lately. I think ASU is going to win that game. Then we get Gonzaga versus Grand Canyon. Better defense for Grand Canyon, way better offense for Gonzaga. A lot of battles for Gonzaga, not as many battles there for Grand Canyon. I got to go with Gonzaga to win that game. Northwestern versus Boise State. This is also disrespectful. Better defense, worse offense, better offense for Boise, but they were able to beat that A&M team. They split with that San Diego State team. They lost twice to a Utah State team. They split with the Nevada. They split with New Mexico. Northwestern, they were top 25 at one point this season. They've had battles with the top of the Big Ten. Northwestern is my pick there. UCLA versus UNC Asheville. Way better defense for UCLA. Pretty similar offenses. Huge discrepancy in the BPI. Bad loss to an Arkansas team. A bad loss to a Dayton team. Barely beating a UCF team that's not even in the tournament. Basically, UCLA is winning that game. Then we get to Bama and Maryland. And now we're going to stop going into each single one. But I think that Bama team's tough. I think they probably beat that Maryland team. Charleston versus Virginia. Virginia's defense is going to overpower, and they probably win that one. Creighton versus Baylor. I don't really respect this year's Baylor team. I think they're susceptible to losses. And I think Creighton is a team that could do that to them. So I'm taking Creighton. Arizona versus Missouri. I would love to say Missouri's going to win this. I think Missouri's a lot better than they're given credit for, but I think this Arizona team is also really tough, and they probably do not beat that Arizona team. Then we get to Houston versus Iowa. Iowa, a team that I think could put up a lot of points, but that is not a team that you want to see if your objective is to score more than your opponents, because Houston will stop you from scoring. Houston wins that game against Iowa. Miami versus Kent State. I think this is going to be a fun matchup, and I could see it going Miami's way, but I'm going to take Kent State. I think Kent State's going to go on a little bit of a tournament run. They're going to make it to the Sweet 16. Then we get Iowa State versus Xavier. Two teams that I think could have a good matchup here in the round of 32, but I got to take Xavier. They've had a pretty solid season. Texas versus Penn State. Penn State has been hot as of late. Texas, another team that is one of the top teams in the country. But I got to go ride with Penn State because I think they've been playing really good basketball as of late. We get to Purdue versus Memphis. Memphis, they did have that big upset against Houston today by 10, but I don't think that you're going to be able to do it again against a team like Purdue. Tennessee versus Oral Roberts. I really want to see a Max Abmas run again, but I think Tennessee probably gets it done there. Providence versus Kansas State. I could see this being a fun matchup, but Kansas State's going to win that one. They're a little bit more battle-tested in my opinion. USC versus Marquette. Marquette sweeps the floor with USC. I'm sorry, USC fans. Kansas versus Illinois. Kansas, a team that Illinois beat in the preseason. Injured Luke Goody. However, the season's gone significantly different for both teams. Illinois started the year off hot. Kansas had a good year all year. If the right stars align, Illinois could win this game, but for this bracket, I'm taking Kansas. St. Mary's versus UConn, a team that I don't really see how you're going to stop their big man at UConn, one of the better big men in the country. I got to go UConn. ASU versus Gonzaga. Once again, taking ASU in this one. Gonzaga versus ASU. Gonzaga, a team that I think is susceptible to losses, but I don't think it's going to be here. I think Gonzaga probably wins that one. We get to a Northwestern team versus UCLA, and Northwestern versus UCLA. Northwestern's a team that I could see making a little bit of a run. It concerns me a little bit because I don't know if there's anybody on their team that necessarily has a great matchup with Jaime Jaquez, but I'm going to take Northwestern. And then we get Alabama versus Virginia. Winner goes on to the Elite Eight. And I think that Virginia team probably wins. Their defense is probably a little bit too good for Alabama, in my opinion. Then we get a Creighton team versus an Arizona team. And I think this is where we see Creighton's run, and I think Arizona probably gets it done and finds their way with Tabellus and company to the Elite Eight. And I'm talking about times for people to end. I think this is probably where Houston ends Kent State's run. And unfortunately, this game is going to Penn State. Penn State, I think, is going to make an Elite Eight run. So if anybody says they saw it first, they saw it here. Penn State's going to make a run because they're going to beat Xavier and make it to the Elite Eight. Purdue versus Tennessee. I think this is probably where Tennessee is biting off a little bit more than they can chew. They can rely on talent for only so long, and I think Tennessee probably stops there. I don't see them beating Purdue. Kansas State versus Marquette. Both of these teams are teams that I think should be respected going into this tournament. They could pull off big upsets. And I think Kansas State pulls off the upset here against Marquette, and they could potentially pull off the big upset and knock off Purdue. Then we get to Kansas versus UConn, and I think we probably get Kansas here. I don't see very many teams that could take them down. UConn's one of them. Illinois is one of them. Gonzaga's one of them. UCLA is one of them. But other than that, I don't really know who's going to take them down. And then we get Gonzaga versus Northwestern. And I'm taking Northwestern. I have a good feeling about Northwestern this year. So that leaves us Virginia versus Arizona, which I think, realistically, let's look at this. I think Virginia is probably the right pick. So we're going to go Virginia. And this is where Penn State's run finally comes to an end. Houston is able to win. And then Purdue versus Kansas State. We'll take a quick gander at them again. A little good defensive there from Purdue. A little better offense from Kansas State, but Zach Edey, once again, tough to stop. Then we'll take another gander here. Pretty decent defense from Northwestern. A little bit better offense from Kansas. Kansas finds their way in. And we ended up being 3 of the 4 1 seeds, making it all the way to the end. And we're taking Virginia in the Final Four to beat Purdue to stop Zach Edey finally. And we're taking Kansas. Kansas will beat Houston and end their reign of terror. And in the national championship game, we will be taking Kansas to win it all. Kansas will be winning this game 72-58. And that is how it's done. That is my entire bracket. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys next time.